Awesome. Thank you so much, Drew. I'm going to try and keep the happy, bubbly persona going. Just, just to check on sound. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So yeah, it was approximately a year ago that I was last part of this meetup.
Yeah.
And we chatted about the infamous and hype around the data mesh concepts. And this is long overdue to do a follow-up and a catch-up on that. But I thought I'd like to focus a little bit specifically on one of the core principles in the whole data mesh practice, and that is data governance. And I call it data governance in the data mesh and beyond, because there's actually so many good principles around how the data mesh is thinking about governance that I think should be embraced in whether you're doing mesh or not. So marrying those two together is kind of the journey I want to take us on. But I want to keep it simple. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the mesh approach itself. I actually thought let's start with what's it Stephen Covey saying, putting first things first. So let's everyone just make sure that we're all on the same page on what is governance actually. Why do we do it? Just recap and refresh a little bit about the basics, and then we'll spend some time on, okay, so now what does that mean in the mesh, and especially this complex phrase or principle that Zhamak Dehghani refers to as federated computational governance. Let's break that up and let's unpack that a bit. Okay, so I just want to say I love interaction. So please don't hesitate, don't hold back, interrupt me. Let's as I go along. But I do tend to get on a soapbox and just run. So please stop me. Don't just stick up a hand. Howard, I'm sure you will interrupt on behalf of those that are.
We will. There is a question on
slightly more cautious.
Yeah, there is already a question on please explain data mesh, but I was seeing that it is the what already you've on your slide. So waiting.
Yep. I think we'll chat a little bit about what is data mesh, and I'll do a little bit of a recap on our wonderful wine story in that. Okay, so broken into two parts: data governance first, laying the foundational blocks, and then putting that in context of the data mesh. But I'd like to take us on a journey. I'm not going to make this presentation technical whatsoever. I want to focus on principles, and that means going on a bit of a story journey today, starting with water. And from water analogy, we will progress and we will look at governance through the eyes of the wonderful Springboks and what we can learn from them, since that is very topical at the moment. And then we'll celebrate and finish off with imagining that we've won the World Cup and we're now going to harvest our grapes and turn that into wine. Okay, so hold on to your seats. Let's go on this journey. Okay. Cool. Starting off with governance. And what does water have to do with it? So I've found that data governance is one of those labels, one of those words, terminology that invokes a lot of different emotions, because depending on who you are and where you got started with governance, you might have certain connotations with it. And sometimes we forget, why do we need governance? And then what is it that we are governing? Okay, so I'm going to stop here. Alexa says I'm tempting fate here.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop here and first quickly ask a question. When we say data governance, what is it that we are governing?
In my opinion, it's the treatment of data.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
Yeah, I would
Anyone
like
else?
to, I mean, the way I see it is we governing the organization and the structures to be able to manage data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree with that. And I think what those answers have in common is what we are not governing is the data. Because data is dead and can't do anything wrong. But we are governing the people that touches the data. We are governing the people that creates data, that uses data and abuses data, that transforms data from one state to another. And we're governing them through processes and policies and practices and all of those kind of things. But the bottom line we need to remember is we're governing people. So that is a core principle. But let's dumb that down, or simplify it. And this is a story. My water story is one that I use mostly when we get started with new clients. That is all business people, and they don't have a clue where we are coming from when it comes to data governance. And I use the analogy of the water value chain. Okay, starting off with the end in mind. The end of the water value chain is the fact that I have the privilege of turning open a tap every day and having clean water, having access to that in my house. Up until about 2-3 years ago, my son was convinced we have this unlimited pool of water just below the house, and he can just do whatever he wants with the water. And he had no concept of how much effort and how many people and how much infrastructure and processes works together to bring that water to the house. So, I mean, we all understand that value chain. There's a lot of plumbing and infrastructure that brings water from the local reservoirs into our houses or buildings. But upstream from this water tank is a very complex process and system to purify that water. Yeah, I love that. I'm going to get into that. Thanks, Howard. There's various different use cases and shapes and formats of water. The typical one we know is that water goes through purification before it is ready for consumption, for mainstream consumption in residential and business areas. Okay. Upstream from that, somewhere, there's a mechanism that catches water. And there's water catchment areas, there's dams built and in the right locations, etc. And upstream from that is the water ecosystem, the rivers and sources where water is naturally captured and then brought into these catchment areas. Now, I mean, it's age old that data is kind of equated to water. Hence, we refer to data lakes. And the concept of data reservoirs is quite common as well. So that's why I think this analogy is very powerful to just make data governance very tangible and practical. Okay. So if this is the ecosystem, let's touch in on how it's coming. There's different levels and different purposes of data. Think about grey water right here in your catchment areas. You know what? That water is not purified for drinking yet. But that does not mean that that water doesn't have value and that doesn't have usefulness. that water can be used for leisure purposes, for skiing on the Sterkstroom Dam, whatever your leisure purpose is in water, fishing, etc. So recreational purposes, it's useful for. Research purposes, it's useful for. Using it for hydropower, it's useful for. In my directly in my house, I have a borehole to water my plants. We catch rainwater to conserve water. And that water can be used for various different use cases, to use the common data terminologies. That does not necessarily go through this full value chain. But this is the mainstream value chain. Now, where does governance fall in? I think what we, unless you are really educated in industrial engineering, etc., what we don't know is that for this all to exist, there's two operating models, and there's a lot of governance that governs everything that works together just to get to the point that I can open a tap. So let's look at that. Not in a lot of detail, but the first set of governance that our municipalities and our government runs is the build operating model. Those are all of the standards and the permits and the rules of who can build purification plants. Where would that be located? What is the recommended building materials and construction rules and regulations for all of these different types of infrastructure in this value chain? Who's allowed to do it? What material are they allowed to do? How should it be done? What is the minimum quality standards for that infrastructure? What is the chemical quality standards that purified water must meet? All of those concepts, that gives you a sense of the governance that goes in whenever we're building new infrastructure relating to the water. We're doing a town extension. We need to set new plumbing throughout the town. This governance structure kicks into place. That means that there's people setting those standards. Once the standards have been set, every time this extension in the ecosystem is built, there's people doing the building, but other people checking that they're aligning with the standards. And that is governance in practice. Okay. Now, on the second dimension, once this infrastructure is built, you have the maintain or the maintenance operating model. And that is all the governance that is in place to ensure that this infrastructure keeps on working according to the standards and the regulations, and that it doesn't fail over and we don't end up with cholera in our taps. Yes, even in the catchment areas, there's governance, okay, because otherwise lakes become swamps. And instead of having the Sterkstroom Dam, you have the Hartebeespoort Dam, overgrown with hyacinths, and no one can do anything there. So this analogy is so powerful, I think, just to bring it to a tangible area. Yeah, I like your comment, Howard, 3 lines of defense. You want to elaborate, contribute there?
Yeah, it's a really nice principle that the accountants brought in terms of having different people making sure and performing different roles and making sure that we're all doing things appropriately. So you'd want to have the people working with data as your first line of defense, and then governance, putting the sort of approach or regulations down, and then some level of audit checking to see whether that's been done, and you're not going to have too much risk or too many issues. So it's about not marking your own homework and making sure that someone else is checking up.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, and that you have in enterprise risk management as well, is that three lines of defense. Every person involved in both the build or the operating model has accountability for ensuring quality of water, or in our case, the quality of data, and the fact that data should be handled with care, has to be protected, should not be abused, should not be wasted, all of those concepts. Everyone, whether you're a builder or a maintenance guy or someone writing the rules throughout this operating model. So that brings us then to the next story, and that's actually a very quite a good segue into, now that we understand that context of what are we governing, why are we governing it? Let's go and learn from our favorite boys at the moment. Let's learn from sports to understand what governance really is. So that's kind of your second and third line defenses. Okay. How does that work in a sports scenario? We think about rugby as a formal sport. There is various different stakeholder groups at play that does the governance thereof. And first off, first dimension, they make the rules. They put down very, very clear rules around who's allowed to do what in which position, where on the field certain things are allowed and where it's not allowed. What is the minimum criteria in order to qualify to achieve a goal or a try? All of those rules and regulations are crafted by sports bodies like World Rugby. And that's their responsibility. They make the rules. And once those rules are put in place, they monitor those rules, but they also sometimes adjust the rules as the game grows, as the game matures, as the context around sports starts changing. I'm thinking back, I'm not sure exactly when, I think it was middle 2010, 2015 about. There was quite a few rule changes in rugby. Maybe the more Fundi rugby fanatics can help me, but they've gone on a journey to change rules because they wanted to increase a bit of the spectator value in it, but also increase a bit of safety, etc. So what they did is they drafted rule changes, but they experimented and piloted in varsity rugby. And I remember Stellenbosch was involved. Some of the Aussie and New Zealand varsities were involved. And those rules were first experimented with, piloted in a smaller context, until it was refined enough to, keep the flow of the game moving, etc. And then they took it up to national and international levels, and they made that mainstream rules. So it's a very nice scenario where we know that if you're doing governance, you don't write the rules once off. the governors of any system is constantly involved in the system, because rules are made not necessarily to be broken, but to change and to evolve as technology's disruption comes in, as company maturity around data evolves, and the readiness for more advanced practices or different practices becomes mature, rules starts to shift and shape. Okay. So that's the first level of governance, making those rules. And then you have that second level of defense, and that is enforcing the rules. And that's typically where an organization starts collaborating with audit and quality assurance practices, etc. But think about referees. Here again, World Rugby is governing this adherence of rules. They govern the governors in the sense that they set the rules that referees must comply with in order to be acknowledged as referees and be allowed to be referees. They write the rules of how those referees should govern and should referee. And all of that is managed as part of your governance package. Okay. Does this make sense? Does this resonate with anyone?
Yeah.
Okay. And it's at this point where we start switching from governance to management. What is data management then, if governance is making the rules and enforcing the rules? Anyone want to, feeling brave to hazard a guess?
It's probably working within the rules.
To do what?
Sorry.
To make the data fit for purpose, to make it usable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool.
Hi. I think
Yes.
is to use the output of the data governance
Mm-hmm.
to produce what we want, to use that outcome. Yeah. I think.
Okay.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's a process. It's a process, no, of data management. Is to use all those outputs. Okay.
Yeah.
That's it.
Do you think it's the outputs of data governance that we want to use? What is it that we want to use and why? And
the process we build, okay?
Yeah.
Because we establish the rules in data governance, we build a process to apply, to all of the rules, okay? And we establish the foundation, and then we need to use all of those things that we build.
Yeah.
As in data management, okay? Need to use all of this, okay? To goals the company or the organization have, okay?
Yep. I think we're getting there, but let's think outside of data management. Let's stick with rugby. What does the managers of rugby teams want to do?
They want to win.
Oh,
When?
there we go. There we go. We want to win.
Yeah.
We want to win. That's why we are doing this.
Yeah. So I was going to say it's governance, management, and objective, aligning with the company's objective. And the company's objective is to take data, whether it's building insights or creating a product. So that's a critical piece.
Absolutely. And that is perfect. Done. That is when. Why are we doing data management? Not so that we can build beautiful data stuff, but so that the business can win in their business strategy. So that the business can achieve their vision and their strategy, so that they can win the market share that they have their eyes on, so they can develop the products and the services and offer that to the market that they want to, so that they can reach the financial targets that they want to. That is why we are doing this.
So would it be making the right decisions based on data to achieve their strategies and objectives?
Yep. And everything that works together on a daily basis in order to reach that destination of making the right decisions and having those decisions actually achieve the business outcomes originally planned. So let's think again in the scenario of rugby. Who's the management of a team? It is the Rassies and the Jocks, the country director of rugby, the head coach, all of the coaches, the whole coaching team. Those are the data managers, strategic level. They are the ones that have the vision in mind, the vision that says we're going to win the World Cup. And they, for the last 4 years, have crafted strategies and have been directing activities to all work together to where we are right now, so that the team is enabled to play in this championship and to perform well. They think about the strategies, the game plans. They put all the right people in the right positions around this team to make sure that this team, or in our analogy, this company, can play the game, the business game, and win. And we have management on various levels. We cascade that down all the way to having team captains and even behind the scene captains, doctors, PR managers, logistics managers, physiotherapists, head of operations. All of these captains in their various different roles are responsible for different slices of activities that all is well orchestrated by the senior level management to play together in harmony in order to, in the end, achieve their goals. But the key principle is to remember that we are doing this not to meet the governance rules. We are doing this to achieve business success. That's why we're doing this. The governance rules are just our guardrails and our guidelines and our boundaries as to what we may and we may not do. But data managers are the people that manages the business and make sure that every player working with the data knows what they can and can't do, but then does what they do to the best of their abilities within the constraints of the rules, so that we can get the most value out of the data so that the business can succeed. Does that resonate with anyone?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I learned early on is that we're not there to chase compliance. If we twist everybody trying to achieve compliance, whatever regulation compliance, that's not what we're looking for.
No.
We go the wrong way when we do that.
Yeah, on the contrary, we sometimes get so hung up on data governance that we start doing everything to govern well, instead of thinking of governance as a means to an end and not the end destination in itself. I think I saw a hand flashing up from Nondumiso.
Yes, it went up and then went down again. I think you may
Very
have
quickly.
answered.
Yeah.
No, sorry, no. I just wanted to react and press the wrong button. Apologies.
No worries.
So
Awesome.
we've
Ross.
got a hand from Ross.
Yes, hi, Yolanda. So,
Hi.
I mean, one of the motivations, I think, for, that approach of just trying to really tackle governance in all its forms, and that is the fear of non-compliance. So often, I mean, business, would be also quite intimidated, in terms of fines, because they put there, for good reason. But those kind of forces do then impinge or impact on, well, we want to avoid governance at all costs, the fines at all costs. So we better implement everything there is to implement. I mean, obviously, you then lean on the experienced practitioners to guide you, through those things. But I think that's what creates that mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. It's a mindset thing, Russ. I think especially highly governed industries like banking are so cautious because of the overwhelming diversity and volume of regulations. And sometimes that gets them to a point where they are serving governance instead of governance serving business.
Right.
I mean, I always joke, BCBS 239 is because back in the 90s and the early 2000s, no one adopted Uncle Kimball and Uncle Inmon's best practices. And then the financial industry made it rules and made it law because of all the problems and mistakes that happened. If we rather embrace data governance, those rules and regulations, as these are things that creates clarity for us. It creates efficiency because we understand who is responsible for what. We understand who is allowed to do what and who is not allowed to do what. It brings efficiency to the business, and it gives the business levers to pull in order to be successful. And sometimes a data manager might be a RASI manager, and he might stretch the rules a little bit and push the boundaries a little bit to be successful, and that's okay. Because all the mechanisms works together to protect holistically in the end. Don, I see your hands up again.
Morning. I'm actually from Canada, and thank you guys. This is very. I had to go into the South African Meetup Group to actually have a bit more access to information. But in my previous job, I was in the e-mental space, and we handle data obviously for kids. But my question is, when you have lack of standards or regulations, even though we're in Canada, there's some standards that haven't been fully developed. As a data governance manager, how do you navigate through that that roadmap?
So if you're saying gap of standards, are you referring to regulatory gaps, as in there's not enough laws and regulations from your side?
Yes, regulatory gaps.
Okay. Well, I mean, you know what? Even in a very lawless country, if the company wants to have great data practices and success ultimately with their data, then they implement their own rules and their own regulations. They're not prescribed by the government. and by the national regulations or even international regulations. Our ethical values govern us. Our moral compass govern us. So if you are a data governance manager or in a data governance role in an organization, be guided by regulation. But if there's gaps in the regulation, don't be limited by it. The only thing you're then gonna have to be ready for is to very clearly articulate the business value of those regulations. You'll have to be able to position very strongly why you believe there should be certain rules in place and how will it benefit business, which I think is actually the best place to drive governance from. Having clarity of rules of where the number 9 and the number 10 may and may not play and what they may and may not do actually puts a lot of power in the coach and director's hands because they have clarity. They know I can use this player in my team to achieve X, Y, and Z. But if I pair this player up with that player and I use them in this combination, I can achieve so much more because of the rules around the different roles in a team. So your governance rules is not necessarily only what you may not do, but recommendations of how to do it better and best, most efficiently, most effectively. Does that answer your question, Don?
Yes, yes. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
And maybe just to add on there that almost starting your program to focus on being value driven, and value is not just money and revenue, it's also risk mitigation and cost reduction. So all of these things we need to be able to express and allow the team or the governance to decide on what's important and allow that shared decision making to come through.
Absolutely. Awesome. Okay, so that kind of puts gives us a foundation of what is governance, why do we do governance? Now, to the question that asked, so what is a mesh and how do we do this in a mesh context? All of the same principles adheres, but let's quickly see what is different within a mesh context. Okay, so I haven't prepared necessarily to go in depth into data mesh as a framework, but let me give you a little bit of highlights around data mesh compared to more well-known approaches like data lakes, data lake houses, data warehouses. And it's very interesting that I've actually seen a bit of an evolution. So 80s and 90s and early 2000s, data warehouse was everything when it came to data analytics. It was a very centralized thinking. And we had one architecture. We had a centralized place where we gathered all data. We pre-processed that data very stringently, formatted in very stringent shapes, star schemas, snowflakes, data architectures, etc. And then we, in an extremely controlled manner, made analytics and insights available from that. And then in 2010, around, the big data technology disruption hit us. And just because of the Hadoop technology, suddenly, I hope there's no technology vendors in here. Asking for forgiveness in advance. But then suddenly, all the technology vendors punted data lakes. And they made it sound so easy. You know, just throw big data servers down, just pump all your data into one environment, and then let all the analysts and data scientists loose on that. And we ended up with lakes and swamps and so on. And analysts started to complain and say, you know what, it's very nice to have access to all of the data in one big pool, but I can't find the data I want. And it's not in a structure that I can actually use it. And I don't have version controls. I don't have snapshots. I can't trend my data. Gradually, companies started to realize, oh, wait, we made a mistake. And they circled all the way back to Uncle Kimball and Enmon's wisdoms, and they brought the data warehouse back into their architecture. And they combined lake and warehouse together, and we came up with this brand new label called Lake Houses, which is currently probably the most prevalent architecture or approach framework that most companies are working towards or are using. And that's this combination of having data lakes, because as we said, data in its raw format still has value and it has use, but then flowing from that various different mechanisms to prepare data into different use cases. But very much that is still what we call a centralized approach. And as more and more companies becomes data mature and large enterprises finds this limitation of centralization as a limitation. It's a constraint. We can't keep on growing the central data engineering team to 100, 150, 200 people, but all of the different business units are still sitting and waiting for those data pipelines to be built, and it takes 3 to 6 months before anyone can build a Power BI view. It's counterproductive, and it's counter being a data-driven organization. So from that, there's various different practices, of which data mesh is one, that is moving towards what the writer of data mesh, Zhamak Dehghani, calls a decentralized socio-technical approach to share, access, and manage analytical data in complex and large-scale environments. Okay. Now, this is a mesh approach is very complex to visualize. Okay, so bear with me. But if I try and dumb the architecture down as simple as possible, what they are saying is, let's allow every business unit, let's empower them to build their own mini data warehouse. So if we think in our water analogy, instead of having one large catchment area, how about we have a landscape of farms, and each of those farms have little ponds from which they get their own water needs. But then we have an infrastructure that helps them share that same water with everyone. Okay, and that's the concept of a mesh. So if you look at this visual, maybe I can just try and zoom in here quickly. If you look at this concept here to say, hey, you might have the ability to ingest data from source into a lake, process it into warehouses, report off of that, maybe even have a technical environment for your own data science. But let's say all of this is for business operations as one node. And then you allow the sales division to build their own little data architecture as node 2. And you allow finance to do this, and you allow brand 1 and brand 2 and brand 3 to do this. And each of those becomes nodes. And then you put the technical architecture on top of that, that allows them to now connect with each other and share data with each other. Okay. Quickly looking at the one question. So what does socio-technical mean? Straightforward. It is the principle of saying there's a lot of technology, but the success of the data mesh approach is all about all of the different people throughout the organization work together. Socially, in your operating model, there's sharing, there's interaction, but there's governance that guides everyone to have clarity. Who is responsible, who owns what data, etc. And maybe give me a little bit of grace time to go through the next analogy that might bring even more clarity in that. Okay. But the data mesh architecture is, or not architecture, framework, way of approaching data management. It's based on 4 principles, which Zhamak Dehghani calls domain data ownership, the principle of managing data as a product, not an asset, but as a product, enabling it with technology for self-service, enabling different business areas to serve themselves with data, but then share with each other. And then the key one in the context of governance we want to look at is this concept of federated but computational governance. Okay, now let's try and take this technical jargon and build it into a story that we can hook that on, we can interpret that. And those who joined us last year will be familiar with the making data into wine story. So I'm going to do a quick recap. I'm going to try and resist to spend too much time on this. But let's quickly dive into this analogy. And I mean, you can think about this as any infrastructure, any manufacturing process. Just give me a moment. Just want to fix one thing here before I there we go. That should do it. Okay. There we go into our story. In any manufacturing process, basically in any business process, a process consists of input, a process, something getting done using that input in order to achieve an output. Am I right in saying that? Okay, so let's take the first part of the wine value chain. And that is that before anyone can drink wine, someone has to plant grapes and has to farm grapes. Okay. And here in this level, there is a lot of processes. There's a lot of stakeholders involved in farming grapes. There's a lot of rules and regulations around this, and the output is bunches of grapes. And lo and behold, the grapes have value. Grapes can be sold as is and can be put on a table for lunch or for supper. But we could also continue on in the value chain and sell those grapes to a juice manufacturer. And that person is going to take the grapes, press it, juice it. And once it's juiced, again, it has value. My son loves grape Tizer. So this could actually be sold off into a new value chain for fresh juice. Doesn't have to be just wine. But let's build our analogy on. Let's say we sell it off to a winemaker now, and the wine gets fermented, the wine gets produced, and it's very intricate processes and guidelines around that, and all of the connoisseurs of highly awarded winemakers in the world will tell you that's not a simple process. But if we then tap into totally a different value chain, we go and buy bottles, we get labels printed, etc., and we combine these 3 individual products to result in a new product. And that's wine bottles to be cased and taken to retail, distributed, etc. Okay. Very simple value chain. And this is where in the mesh framework, the principle of data as a product becomes important. Because if as an example, your grapes is your raw data, that raw data is a product. That raw data has rules around it. It has people being assigned accountability to own it, that has governance responsibility to ensure that grapes of the right quality is sold off for juicing purposes. Grapes of inferior quality could be used for other use cases, other purposes. So there's a whole governance set of standards around data that is in its original source format. Once you pump that, let's assume we follow a relatively straightforward architecture, and we pump that into a landing area or a data lake where we juice it now. In that juice format, it has value. And in that juice format, you're going to think about who owns it in this format, who has what kind of responsibility to get it into this format and to protect it while it's in this format, and to make decisions around the next step in the value chain, who's allowed to use the juice for what purposes, etc. And so I think you get the gist of the analogy. So the value chain continues on. Now, I mean, if we take that back into, wait, I'm just going to take it back into, my slide animation is not working. Around the wine industry, we know there's a whole bunch of governance rules. We know there's labor regulations, health and safety, there's wine regulation rules around origin, vintage, year, variety, etc. Standards around bottling, labeling. There's alcohol distribution rules and regulations and laws. And then there's the responsibility to the consumer to warn the consumer of the danger of alcoholism, etc., and the consumer just ignores those. And then you also have the governance bodies, the Department of Labor, Agriculture, that makes up these rules. You have provincial liquor bodies. You have the Department of Trade and Industry and Corporation, which hosts the National Liquor Authority. And you even have the information regulator that talks about POPIA, and data privacy and access to information. And the wine industry must comply with making certain information about their products readily and publicly available, etc. And that is where governance, level 1, making rules, level 2, enforcing rules, comes into play here. And then in each of these operations, in the farms, in the wineries, in the bottling plants, and in logistics and distribution, the people actively involved are the managers and the players of the game, and they aim to produce the right quality of wine and get it on the shelves of the right consumers and make the most money out of that. Okay. Now, how does this work in a federated context? The principle around federation versus centralized governance is, dare I say, we have to think about how does the US govern their country. They have a federated model. They have rule makers on national level, different rule makers who has to comply to national rules, but on state level. And again, different rule makers on local levels. Similar to us in our governance structure in South Africa. And then also from a compliance perspective, you have national policing, you have provincial policing, you have local policing. That happens. That's the concept of federation. Federation works when there's consistency and clarity of the rules, and when those rules are focused on not trying to prescribe every move we make with our data, but rather to put in minimum rules and guidelines with the principle of guardrails. The labor law is called the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, not the all-encompassing, fully descriptive law around dealing with staff. It's minimum requirements. Okay. Sometimes we fall in the trap that governance tries to anticipate every possible scenario and create guidelines for every possible decision that any player in our ecosystem will ever make. Instead of saying, let's think about what is the bare minimum rules for us as an organization to operate efficiently and effectively and still have a sense of confidence that our data will be the right quality and our data will be safe. And then as we grow, as we experience challenges and incidents, etc., we gradually adjust the rules to cater for that. I think now is a good time to pause and just revisit some of the questions that has come in. Howard?
Yes.
I want to, Mahela's had a comment on build culture, and I want to spend a little bit of time right at the end on that.
Okay. And then we
That's
also
important.
have Tumelo that's asking about that combination between centralized and decentralized is how do you keep that that approach, the balance, right? And I think you've answered it. I think Tumelo was comfortable with your answer. Then we have Owen asking, how can organizations begin to transition to a data mesh? And there was one more in terms of Ndemiso asked about what is the framework used for data recoveries, and how does data governance get involved with that?
Okay. So thinking about that and maybe going into the next slide where we just revisit Mesh's approach to federated and computational governance would address that answer for Ndemiso. I think if we think about how can organizations begin the transition to a data mesh approach, I'm going to have the typical diplomatic answer, and it depends on where that organization is right now and what do they have. Where are you starting from is always an important place to start. So if you want to have the GPS map, it won't give you directions unless it knows where you are. Okay. But what is nice about the data mesh approach is it is not an approach that requires you to totally demolish a data warehouse or the data lake that you might already have, but you can rather scale and leverage that. So if you already have, I'm going to grab a hypothetical. Yeah. If you're an organization and you have a central data warehouse, but you know what? In reality, it's only the sales department using it. And the rest of your business units have like 1 or 2 reports flowing out of it, but they're not necessarily mature yet. Maybe that is an option, is to say, okay, let's rebrand our enterprise data warehouse to our sales data warehouse. And let's go and meet with the other business communities and say, okay, well, what type of architecture, what type of self-service capability is going to allow you as a business unit in your own right to self-service? But then start aligning that the technical standards and the data standards are such that your mesh gradually evolves, that it can share data across different nodes in the mesh. But yeah, ultimately the answer is it depends, Owen.
Also, I think what's also important there, Yolanda, is getting that common understanding and behavior. As you said, that agreement on what the base rules are, so that it all gets applied appropriately in each area. Now, fortunately, that's a challenge we sit with all of them, centralized wherever we are. We want to get that way of working correct.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is the magic juice, that even if you go and read the book of the data mesh and you start on this data mesh journey, those fundamental principles, it's all about getting standards, getting clarity, and giving people an understanding of what they can, what they can't, and what is recommended as they should. And that needs to be universal. Now, we quickly try and get a bird's eye view of what data mesh talks about when they say federated and computational governance. She advocates for, when you think about governance, think about employing systems thinking. Data governance is not something that runs in isolation. It is something that has to permeate all of the interaction points, all of the business activities throughout the organization. Because you know what? What is data really? It is the waste product of business operations. Business does what it does every day and causes data to happen. And that byproduct tells us what has happened in the business. So trying to separate data in isolation and making rules for the data without thinking about what is the rules for business and how does the rules around data integrate with that, is where we might be losing the plot. So think about that systems thinking. We have to think about the whole organization. In the typical TOGAF model, it's people, process, and technology. Adding the fourth, and data. It's not an or. Okay. Then we have to look at federated and computational separately. Federated is about the operating model. It's about how do we direct or give guidelines around the players of the rugby game, and who sits where in the organization that's going to be writing those rules, that's going to be adopting the rules and playing the game according to the rules. Okay. So we're thinking about the people here. And also architecturally, we start thinking about the technology that's going to enable the people to do what they do best. The computational, that is where we start focusing on the technology. So now we're not only going to think about our architecture as selecting technologies that allows us to ingest data, code pipelines, store data, and serve data. But we're actually going to start choosing technologies that helps us to automate a lot of our enforcements of the rules, our controls, etc., and our ability to monitor how well the players are complying with the rules, right into the technology that the people use on a daily basis. That is the focus of the computational. And I think that is where, thinking back to the question Dumiso around frameworks for data recovery, the ability to, if I think about it in privacy context, in POPIA context, the ability to have data be forgotten and truly forgotten. So if you're disposing of data, how, if you have this federated mesh of data workspaces all over the organization, how do you enforce that data gets archived or deleted when it should? Those are things that can be automated and the capabilities are in the technology you choose and that you use. New technical capabilities for computational becomes important. And let's look at it at those, both the operating model and the technologies very quickly. So from an operating model, it's a federated operating model. So we're thinking around top-down roles as well as bottom-up roles. And this is from a business perspective as well as from a data and IT perspective. And then where the two shall meet, that is where everyday touching of data happens. Whether it is business people consuming data or in the build operating model, engineers and analysts producing new data products using the tools in the platform. This is where that happens. Okay. But as you think about your roles and responsibilities, start at the top level. But again, from my experience, don't separate it from business executive responsibilities. If we quickly look at this, it's a generic business operating model. Let's say you have your business has a marketing division, a logistics division, sales division, but operations is actually broken up into different brands. Think, shall I pick a label? Because I saw a label, TFG. If this is Fushini and this is Markham's and this is Total Sports, each of them might want their own self-service data capability. And in your business operating model, they have their own business leadership, executive leadership, which collaborates for business operational purposes. They collaborate with marketing leadership and with logistics that provides business services to them. So in a data accountability model, those same business managers must be responsible for the data as well. The data they create and the data they consume and what they use it for. So that is what I mean with this top-down, bottom-up thinking. Gradually, if we think about having multiple data teams all over your organization, whether they are responsible for source systems and making sure that the quality of data originated in a source system meets the fit for purpose criteria, or whether they are actually analysts and engineers building information products or analytics or whatever they're building from the different levels in the data value chain. Think conceptually around who's the different players and what is their roles and responsibilities, and define that in your rules that governs who's the players and what are they allowed to do. Okay. So that's the federated part. The computational part is now where we start thinking, okay, if we're going to set down minimum standards around data modeling, if we decide we're going to follow star schema, then we have to set those rules down. And we have to think about in computational, what technologies can we put down that will enable the players in this data ecosystem to design their data products according to a Kimball approach? And how are we going to enforce that? And how can we use the technologies for it? We're going to, in a data mesh approach, we are going to pay a lot more attention to metadata technologies. Because if you think about that other picture, if you have 50 teams in this large enterprise, and all of them are building data products everywhere, but they want to know who else in the business has a data product that might have value for us to analyze or to enrich our data with, guess what? They're going to want to go onto a Take-A-Lot screen and search what products is there out there in this organization. And they're going to want to see, you know what? Here we go. Here's the customer segmentation. And customer segmentation is a reference data list offered by the sales team. I'm going to buy this data product from them. And I'm going to integrate and connect my portion of the data mesh to have an interface to their portion of the data mesh so that I can use that table as a product. So metadata type technologies, the ability to catalog your data, to describe your data, to have clarity who owns that data product, what is the rules around if I want to get access to that data product, is critical in a mesh approach. Quality, lineage, I think you get the gist because we're running out of time, but this is where in a mesh approach, governance becomes very practical, but very important to think about. Because as you federate, inevitably you're going to have more and more and more smaller micro teams working with your data and creating new data products. So to make governance as easy as possible, we have to lean into the technologies and leverage the capabilities that gives us as well. This is a good place to pause.
Yeah.
And to close out on. And I think if there's nothing else, before we go into questions, if there's nothing else you take away from this, remember that we are not doing data management to execute on governance. We are doing governance and data management to execute on business strategy and enable the business to win. And we are dismally failing at this if we are trying, if we are framing it the other way around. Okay, that was my closing statement, Howard.
Fantastic.
Back to you.
Thanks, Yolanda. So maybe I'm sure there are quite a few questions and comments. Are there? If people could just raise their hands, and we'll try to just have a few before maybe about 5 minutes of questions, and then we can close out. Any questions from anybody? Yes, sir. You got first.
Nimbavi.
Will you start, Mohammed?
Yes. Harun is here. Actually, what about data mart? What I read about the CDMP book, it is mentioned that when the data is in the data warehouse, you can have a data marts, which is related to finance department and supply chain and logistics and HR. So now what I understand from data mesh, what you are saying that every department will have its own data. It will have own data and they will work on that. And later on, we can build on top of that aggregation also in the data warehouse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's what the data mesh does. Where in the Kimball approach, we typically first built the enterprise data warehouse, and then from that built various data marts for different business areas.
Correct.
The data mesh tends to flip that around and say, let's empower every business area to build their own data mart. But we already set the rules down for, if we stick to the Kimball language, for conformed dimensions and consistent data practices and data standards in how we structure the tables, naming conventions, all of that. And then every business area builds their own data mart. And then instead of having everything then flow into a central repository called a data warehouse and creating a physical enterprise database, you rather put the integration technologies on top of it and just semantically have the ability to hook all of these data marts together so that you can get the enterprise view. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks, Sarun. Thank you very much. And then we have Billy.
Billy, my friend.
Hey, Yolanda.
Hey.
Yeah, as always, very insightful insights. I suppose a bit of a non-technical question. Just thinking about sort of the comments around being outcomes-based and thinking about the business winning. How do you sort of communicate that to executives? If we think about that top-down approach, how do you communicate to executives that this is where they should be investing effort and time? While, some executives might view other means as a way of quote unquote winning. Like, how do we sit across executives and try build a business case that data is actually one of the key things they should be focusing on, and it doesn't always start with seeing fancy sales dashboard. We must invest effort in this data governance, this data governance steps first. How do we communicate that?
You know what? That is why I love this federated approach. Because if we make each of those business executives owners of their own data and owners of their data strategies, then it's no longer our responsibility to try and convince them. It's their responsibility to articulate how they are going to use data to achieve their business strategies. So now here's the culture thing. Now, instead of the data community trying to convince the business that they must use data, data mesh fosters a culture of we as an organization are using data to win in our business strategies. And now your CEO should be telling all his executives, for your next business strategy, you present to me, I want to see how you are going to use our data to achieve your business success. It becomes their responsibility. In a centralized model, the poor chief data officer has this pressure to deliver an ecosystem that enables business to use data, as well as the responsibility to prove to the business that the business can get value out of the data. I mean, that's like telling my blood must convince me that I need my blood. That doesn't make sense. We should be educating our executives to the point where they are enabled and empowered to drive their businesses in a data-driven way. And they should be asking us, I want to achieve X, Y, and Z value. That means I need X, Y, and Z from you. And that is the cornerstone of the data mesh approach, because we are enabling self-service. We will give you the tools you need. We will give you the guidelines. We will even help you build the skills in your business unit to work with the data and build your own data products according to what you need to be successful. But you're responsible. I hope that answers the question.
Very much so. Thanks, Yolanda.
Fantastic. Any other questions? Anybody else? I think we got to the end of those questions. I just had one for myself in terms of, you mentioned that metadata becomes extremely important. How do we handle this in terms of the enterprise data model or the enterprise ontology or the semantics that keep these federated domains together? Because we all understand that these domains can't operate on their own, and there are certain rules across the domains.
Yep, absolutely. And I've in the last client I've supported on this journey, especially where we implemented a data mesh framework for them. I used the enterprise data model as a cornerstone in the build operating model. Remember the water story with the build versus maintain. If you think about it in that water analogy, the enterprise data model becomes like the city blueprint that draws a picture of where should there be data pipelines and which data domains should sit where and who should own it. And there it might be a central function that collaborates with all of the different data owners in each of the business areas to say, okay, let's draw this enterprise data model picture on a conceptual and logical level so that we have this blueprint of how does the data actually tell the story of what happens in business? Because that's what a data model does.
Yeah.
And then once we have this enterprise data model picture conceptually and logically, it becomes a very nice tool to have those discussions with business to say, okay, who should be owning which part of this data model?
Right.
Who should be owning which data domains? and making decisions and setting down the standards and the minimum criteria for data quality, and who makes the rules of who's allowed to see what data and access it and use it for what purposes. So it becomes your planning tool and your tool to make decisions around ownership, rights, and responsibilities as part of governance. And then you maintain it ongoing as a conceptual blueprint, but then the physical level of those model designs becomes instantiated, and it, instead of having one lake and one reservoir, you now use this blueprint and you build multiple lakes and multiple reservoirs all over the organization. And then you put the plumbing in place that connects them all.
Fantastic. Owen, there's a question from you, sir. Let's do the last one from Owen and then. Sorry, Owen.
Yes, yeah. So I think it's now it's clear that you said you have many lakes and then we can do plumbing. So you can plumb it and then you can get the data, whatever we need. Let's say we have finance, we have HR, we have supply chain. So we can have a plumbing between these three lakes and we can pull the data from that reservoir. But technically it's very, what do you think? I'm from technical background. It seems it's very difficult also on the other side to maintain these many reservoirs where the data is coming and then to make link between them and to pull the data and to, because sometimes we have a discrepancies in the data also on the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it could become a technical nightmare. I fully support that. And that is the one area where I believe the data mesh framework still needs to mature. And it's going to take the mesh framework conceptually and theoretically is a very, very good framework. In the context of large enterprises where the business model is federated. And it works for that, where large enterprises wants to scale. But architecturally and technically for IT, it could become a nightmare. Now, in the book, it does start touching on things like infrastructure as code, data pipeline that is metadata driven. And if you start getting those kind of practices, and that's probably where cloud infrastructure is really going to become very valuable in enabling us to build more federated mesh architectures. Because then you can start thinking about, how do I do this infrastructure as a code? How do I set a conceptual and logical IT standard for what does a data lake look like? And then I have infrastructure as code that can very quickly spin up a lot of different nodes that complies with these standards. Yeah.
I think that's exactly what Azure. I've seen some of the Azure examples where they set a template for each domain, each generic template, and then each time a domain is created, it comes from that template, and it brings the infrastructure and rules along with it. So there's a lot of that needs to be in place.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Owen, does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you so much. And Yolanda, very impressive. Mashallah, you have great knowledge and your explanation is very nice.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Excellent. Yolanda, I think we'll bring it to an end there. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Yolanda, for a lovely presentation. Everyone was very impressed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye, Yolanda.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Yolanda.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Bye,
Yolanda.
everyone.